Jeremiah Prescott woke to the smell of wood smoke and the bite of rope at his wrists. And the first thing he understood was that he could not move his arms more than an inch in any direction. The second thing he understood was that an orc woman was crouched in front of him, close enough that the firelight caught the gold in her eyes, and she was working at the knots that bound him to the wagon wheel with the careful, deliberate fingers of someone who did not want to be seen doing what she was doing. "Hold still," she said low, in a voice like gravel dragged through honey. "You will bruise worse if you fight it." He held still. It was easier than he expected, mostly because his skull throbbed where something had struck him during the raid, and because the woman kneeling before him was easily the most striking and most terrifying person he had ever seen up close. She wore fitted raider leathers, dark oxblood hide laced tight across a powerful frame, a war belt slung low over her hip with an axe and a long knife sheathed at her thigh, and iron rings threaded through the tips of her ears that caught the firelight when she turned her head. Her tusks were small, more felt than seen, curving just past her lower lip, and there was a streak of blue war paint smeared beneath one eye, half sweated away by a hard day's ride. She was beautiful in a way that made his chest hurt, though he would not have admitted that to anyone, least of all to her. "You're loosening it," he said. His voice came out cracked. "I am tightening it," she said, not looking up. "Do not tell the others otherwise." He looked past her shoulder at the camp. A dozen orcs moving between low fires, tending horses, sharpening blades, the wrecked shapes of 2 supply wagons canted in the mud where the caravan had been run down that afternoon. He remembered flashes of it, the scream of the lead ox, the crossbow bolt that had taken the caravan guard beside him through the throat, the huge green-skinned shapes coming out of the tree line like a landslide given legs. He remembered being pulled from his saddle by a fist closed around his collar, and after that very little until now. "The others are dead," he said. It was not a question. "The soldiers, yes." She glanced at him, and something in her face was not quite cruelty. "You are a map maker," I saw the satchel, rolls of paper, ink, a brass instrument for measuring angles. "Men do not fight for such things, so you lived." "I'm a surveyor," he said. "For the Crown's Border Commission. We're meant to be resettling Fort Kestrel at the edge of the charted lands. I chart the roads, the water, the good ground for planting. I don't fight anyone." "I know." She pulled the rope, and to his surprise the loop around his left wrist loosened by a full finger's width, enough that the numbness in his hand began, slowly, to needle back into feeling. "That is why you are tied to a wheel instead of left in the grass with the others." Her name, he would learn before the night was through, was Ghorza Ironblood, and she was a raid captain of the Scarntooth clan, third in standing beneath the chief himself. And she had, for reasons she did not explain that first night, decided that Jeremiah Prescott was not going to die. The camp settled as the fires burned low. A broad-shouldered orc with a scarred jaw and a single tusk longer than the other Draguk, Jeremiah would learn his name was Draguk, came and stood over him with his arms crossed, studying him the way a butcher studies a hanging carcass. "He should be dead already," Draguk said to Ghorza, in the common tongue, apparently for Jeremiah's benefit as much as hers. "The old law is clear. Men who chart our hills for the Crown die on the hills they chart. You know this law, Ironblood." "I know it." Ghorza did not rise from where she crouched near Jeremiah, and something about the way she remained low at his level made Draguk's mouth twist with distaste. "And I know the law of the claim right, which says whoever fells a man in battle holds the right of his fate for a moon's turn, until the clan moot decides otherwise. I felled him. He is mine to decide until the moot says different." "A moon's turn," Draguk said, "to keep a pet." "To decide," Ghorza said, and there was something final in the way she said it, a captain's voice, that made Draguk grind his teeth and stalk off toward the fires without another word. Jeremiah watched him go, then looked at Ghorza. "Thank you," he said, because it seemed the only honest thing to say. "Do not thank me yet, mapmaker." She reached out and with 2 fingers tilted his chin so the firelight fell across the darkening bruise at his temple. Her touch was rough-skinned and warm, and he felt it travel down through him like a struck bell. A moon is a short mercy. It's more mercy than I expected from a raider who ran down my caravan an hour before sunset. Something flickered behind her eyes, not quite a smile, but close to it. You gave your water flask to my wounded scout while you were still bleeding from the fall, before you knew who any of us were. He remembered that, dimly, a young orc boy, no older than 16 summers by the look of him, clutching a crossbow wound in his side, and Jeremiah's hands moving before his mind had caught up to what he was doing, unstopping his flask, pressing it into the boy's shaking fingers. He had not thought of it as bravery. He had thought of it as the only decent thing available to do. "That is why you are tied to a wheel and breathing," Ghorza said, "and not lying in the grass with the rest of them." She finished with the rope, leaving it looking taut to any eye that did not look too closely, and settled back on her heels a few feet from him, her axe across her knees, and did not leave his side again that whole night. They marched for 4 days after that, deeper into the borderlands, along game trails no map Jeremiah had ever drawn had recorded, and each night the ritual repeated itself. Draguk's cold demands that the claim right be set aside, that the moot be called early, that the human be killed as an example or ransomed for iron and grain. Ghorza's flat refusals. And after the camp settled, Ghorza crouching by the wagon wheel or the picket line where Jeremiah was bound, loosening what she had tightened in front of the others, giving him water, giving him strips of dried meat from her own share, and more than either of those things, giving him conversation. "You have no wife," she said on the second night, not quite a question. "No," he shifted, easing his shoulders where the rope had rubbed them raw. "No wife. My work keeps me on the roads too much. Most towns think a man who spends his days drawing lines on paper instead of working a plow or swinging a hammer is a strange sort of man to marry a daughter to." "You are strange," Ghorza agreed, and he laughed despite the rope and the bruise and the very real danger he was in, because there was nothing cruel in the way she said it. "And you?" he asked. "No husband waiting on you back at your clan's fires?" Her jaw tightened just slightly, and for a moment he thought he had trespassed somewhere he should not have. "I showed mercy once before, to a human traitor who had done my clan no wrong but wear the wrong colors. My standing has never fully recovered from it. Orc men do not court a captain the clan whispers is soft." "You're not soft," he said, before he could think better of it. "You're the only reason I'm alive." She looked at him a long moment, firelight moving across the plane of her cheek, the small silver-blue paint smudge, the strong line of her jaw, and something passed between them that neither of them named aloud. Not yet. On the 5th day, word came ahead of them that the clan moot had been called 2 days early, at Draguk's insistence, and that the chief himself, an old, tired orc named Craghull who wanted peace with the human garrisons more than he wanted to feed a feud, had agreed to hear the matter of the mapmaker's fate that very night. It did not go well. Jeremiah knelt in the dirt at the edge of a great fire, hands still bound, while orcs he had never seen before shouted arguments over his head in a mixture of their own tongue and the common speech, until Craghull raised one scarred hand and silence fell like a dropped blade. "The claim right stands until the moon turns," the old chief said, "but I will not risk the peace of this clan over one human with an ink pot. Draguk is right that the old law names a price for men who chart our hills. Ghorza is right that mercy is not always weakness." He looked at Ghorza, and something almost like pity crossed his weathered face. "So I will split the difference the way old chiefs do when they are tired of shouting. The man is handed to the human garrison at the ruined fort 3 days south, for ransom, as is proper, and Ghorza Ironblood is stripped of her captaincy for defying the old law without the moot's leave, effective this night." The camp erupted. Draguk's face split with something close to triumph. Ghorza did not move, did not speak, but Jeremiah, watching her, saw her hands close into fists at her sides hard enough that her knuckles paled beneath the green. That night, for the first time, she did not merely loosen the knots. She came to him long after the fires had burned to embers and the camp slept, moving without sound despite her size, and knelt beside the wagon wheel he had been retied to for the moot, and this time her knife did not stop at loosening. It sawed clean through the rope in 3 strokes, and his hands came free, and he sat there for a moment simply staring at his own raw wrists as if they belonged to someone else. "Ghorza, do not thank me," she said again, exactly as she had the first night, though her voice shook this time in a way it had not before. "And do not ask me why. I do not fully know myself." She pulled him up by the arm, strength enough in that one grip to lift a man twice her size, and looked at him with a fierceness that had nothing to do with the axe on her hip. "I am no longer a captain of this clan. I have no honor left here to lose. If I hand you to Draguk's justice, I lose nothing further and gain his favor. If I let you go, I lose everything I have built in 15 summers of hard riding, and gain a human mapmaker who does not even know these hills." "Then why?" he asked, though he thought, even as he said it, that he already half knew the answer, had known it since the first night. Watching her fingers work at the knots she had no reason to loosen for a captive worth nothing to her but ransom. "Because Draguk's justice ends with your throat cut over a fire," she said, "and I find, mapmaker, that I have grown unwilling to watch that happen." They ran that night, the 2 of them, on foot at first, and then on a stolen horse she cut free from the picket line with the same knife that had freed his hands. And behind them, the camp woke to shouting, and the sound of Draguk's voice raised in a fury that carried for a mile through the dark pines. They rode hard for 2 days, resting only when the horse could go no further, sharing what food Ghorza had managed to snatch from the camp stores in the chaos of their leaving hard bread, a wedge of goat cheese, a skin of sour wine, and somewhere in that flight, huddled together beneath a rock overhang while rain hammered the hillside outside, Jeremiah found himself no longer thinking of her as his captor, or even simply his rescuer, but as something closer to the only person in the world who had ever chosen him, entirely and without reservation, over everything she had spent her whole life building. "I've never had anyone fight for me before," he told her that night, the rain a steady curtain beyond the rock, her shoulder warm against his in the narrow shelter. "Not once. Not my father, who thought a boy who liked drawing lines instead of swinging an axe was soft in the head. Not the garrison commanders who use my maps and forget my name by the time the ink dries." "Then they were fools," Ghorza said simply, and there was no softness in the way she said it, only a plain, hard certainty that made his throat tight. "I do not fight for fools, Jeremiah Prescott. I do not waste myself on men who are not worth the wasting." It was the first time she had used his full name, and something in the sound of it in her mouth, rough and careful at once, undid something in him that had been knotted tight his whole life. He kissed her first, or perhaps it was closer to true that they moved toward each other in the same breath, her hand coming up to the side of his face at the same moment his mouth found hers, and it was not a gentle thing, not at first. It was 2 people who had each spent years being overlooked or underestimated finally being seen, hungrily, by someone who understood exactly what they were worth. She kissed like she fought without half measures, and when she finally drew back, her forehead against his, her breath uneven, she said, low and rough, "I did not loosen those knots for kindness alone, mapmaker." "I know," he said. "I felt it in the way you tied them back up every morning, tighter than they needed to be, so no one would look twice." "You felt too much then," she said, but she was smiling, tusks and all, and he thought he had never in his life seen anything as fine as that smile by rainlight. They reached the ruined walls of Fort Kestrel on the 9th day, half-starved, saddle-sore, and utterly unwilling to be parted from one another, and it was there that the next, harder part of their story began. Fort Kestrel had been a proper stone keep once, in the days before the last Orc War had swept through the borderlands and left its towers cracked and its gate hanging from one hinge. But the Crown's Border Commission had marked it for resettlement 2 years past, and a small garrison under a hard-eyed captain named Aldrich Vane had been sent to hold it while settlers trickled in behind them to rebuild the walls until the long fallow fields beyond. Jeremiah's survey work was the whole reason such resettlement was even being considered. His careful maps of water and soil and defensible ground had convinced the Crown's commission the fort was worth the coin to rebuild, and so when he rode in through the broken gate, hollow-eyed and travel-worn, Captain Vane's relief at seeing him alive was plain on his weathered face. It did not extend, even slightly, to the orc woman riding at his side. Prescott. Vane's hand had gone to his sword hilt before he'd even fully registered who was with him. "Step away from that thing." "She's not a thing, Captain." Jeremiah's voice came out steadier than he felt. "She's the reason I'm alive to report back to you at all. The raiders that hit our caravan would have killed me on the spot if not for her. She's a Scarntooth raider." Vane's eyes had not left Ghorza, who sat her horse with a stillness that Jeremiah had learned, over their days of flight, meant she was calculating exactly how many of the dozen soldiers now gathering in the yard she could put down before they overwhelmed her. "I've seen her mark before, on the arm of a dead scout not 2 months back. There's a bounty on any Scarntooth raid captain taken alive, from the Border Commission itself. 500 silver crown marks for information, 1,000 for the woman delivered breathing." "She's not a captain any longer," Jeremiah said. "She gave that up for me." "That's not my concern, Prescott." Vane's voice hardened. "My concern is a fort full of settlers who lost kin to Scarntooth raids and a commander's duty to see the bounty collected and the peace of this valley kept. Stand aside." He did not stand aside. He put himself, quite deliberately, between Ghorza's horse and the dozen soldiers now ringing the courtyard with hands on sword hilts, and he said, in a voice that surprised him with its own steadiness, "No." It was, he would later think, the single bravest thing he had ever done, and also the most foolish, because Vane could have had him clapped in irons on the spot for obstruction and taken Ghorza regardless. But something in the utter simplicity of his refusal, and perhaps something in the exhausted, wind-burned, thoroughly unglamorous truth of the two travelers before him, a mapmaker who had clearly not slept properly in days, and an orc woman who had clearly given up everything to keep him breathing, made Vane hesitate. "She stays under guard," Vane said finally, "in the old grain cellar, until I've sent word to the commission and had instruction on what's to be done." "And you'll answer for this decision to them, Prescott, same as I will." It was not freedom, but it was not a noose either, and Jeremiah, standing in the wreck of a courtyard with his heart still hammering, understood that he had just made an enemy of the fort's commander and bound himself, publicly and irrevocably, to an orc woman the whole valley had reason to fear. He did not regret it for one single moment. The grain cellar beneath the old keep became, over the following weeks, the center of a secret that grew slowly larger than either of them had intended, a private world carved out beneath the noise and suspicion of the resettling fort above. Jeremiah brought her food beyond her rationed guard's portion, blankets against the cellar's damp cold, books from his own satchel that she devoured with a hunger for learning that surprised him, given how little he'd expected an orc raider to care for the written word. She taught him, in turn, words of her clan's tongue, low and musical things that meant more than their common equivalents. A word for the specific quiet of dawn before the birds wake, a word for the loyalty owed to someone who has seen you at your worst and stayed anyway. "You keep coming back," she said one evening, weeks into her confinement, watching him duck through the low cellar door with a lantern and a covered dish balanced in one hand. "Vane watches you like a hawk watches a hare. You will lose your position with the commission if this continues." "Probably," he agreed, settling across from her on the cellar's packed dirt floor, close enough that their knees touched. "I've decided I don't much care." "You should care." She took the dish from him, but her eyes stayed on his face. "I have cost you everything a careful man builds his life around. You've given me everything a lonely man never thought he'd have," he said. "I'll take that trade every day the sun rises, Ghorza." She set the dish aside, untouched and reached for him instead, and in the low lantern light of that cellar, surrounded by old grain sacks and the smell of dust and stone, she kissed him with a slow thoroughness that had none of the desperate hunger of that first storm-soaked night and all the deeper certainty of two people who had chosen, again and again, across every hard day between then and now, to keep choosing each other. Her hands were rough and sure against his jaw, his shoulders, and when she finally drew back she pressed her forehead to his, exactly as she had that first night on the run, and said, "Then I will take mine, mapmaker. Every day the sun rises." Word of Jeremiah's captive love reached the wider valley faster than either of them had hoped it would not. Settlers newly arrived till the fields beyond Fort Kestrel's walls whispered of the surveyor who had brought an orc raider home instead of a bounty, and their whispers were not kind. A woman named Hetty Marsh, whose husband had died in a Scarntooth raid 2 winters past, spat at Jeremiah's feet in the market row and called him a traitor to every settler who'd ever buried kin because of green-skinned murder. An old farmer named Coben refused to sell him seed grain, muttering that a man who'd bed a monster wasn't fit to grow honest wheat. Jeremiah bore it because there was nothing else to do, and because every insult thrown at him in daylight was one Ghorza did not have to hear from behind the cellar's stone walls. But it was Draguk's arrival, 3 weeks into her confinement, that turned whispered prejudice into open, immediate danger. He came at dusk with 15 riders at his back, Scarntooth colors flying, and demanded at the broken gate that the traitor Ghorza Ironblood be delivered to clan justice, or the fort would burn. Vane, no fool, refused him outright and set his soldiers to the walls, but it was Jeremiah who understood, with a cold drop in his stomach, that Draguk's true purpose was not diplomacy at all. He meant to use the standoff as cover to slip riders round to the cellar under cover of dark and take Ghorza by force, dragging her back to face the moot's harshest judgment for her defiance, a fate that in Scarntooth law meant death by the old blooding stones. He did not sleep that night. He kept watch at the cellar door himself, an old hunting knife in his belt that he had never in his life used against another living soul, and when 3 shapes came slipping along the inner wall past midnight, he was ready enough to shout the alarm before they reached the door, buying Vane's soldiers the minutes they needed to drive Draguk's raiders back over the wall in a running, chaotic fight that left 2 of Vane's men wounded and 1 of Draguk's dead in the mud of the courtyard. Draguk withdrew before dawn, but his voice carried back over the walls as he went, promising he would return with the whole strength of the clan behind him, and that this time no mapmaker's knife would keep his prize from him. It was Vane, grim-faced in the gray dawn light, who came to find Jeremiah afterward, standing at the cellar door where he had held his lonely watch all night. "You could have let them take her," Vane said. "Ended this whole mess without a drop of my men's blood spilled." "I could have," Jeremiah agreed. "I didn't want to." Vane studied him a long moment, something shifting behind his hard eyes. "That's the second time you've put yourself between her and a blade, Prescott. First mine, now Draguk's. It won't be the last, Captain, if it comes to it." Something almost like respect crossed Vane's face, grudging and unwilling, but there. "The commission's answer came by rider yesterday while you were busy keeping watch. They want the bounty collected. The woman delivered for judgment at the border court, dead or alive, doesn't much matter which to them." He paused. "I haven't decided yet whether I'm going to follow that instruction to the letter." It was not comfort, not exactly, but it was the first crack of light Jeremiah had seen in weeks, and he held on to it as he went below to tell Ghorza what had passed in the night, and what threat still gathered beyond the walls. On both sides now human bounty and orc blood justice both hunting the same woman, and Jeremiah Prescott standing, quite alone against both, as the only thing between her and either fate. The days that followed moved with the strange, taut quality of a held breath. Draguk did not return immediately, which everyone in the fort understood to mean he was gathering greater numbers, and Vane's soldiers drilled at the walls with new urgency, while settlers argued in the market row over whether the mapmaker's orc woman was worth the coming fight at all. Jeremiah felt the weight of every one of those arguments pressing on him each time he crossed the courtyard, but he found, to his own surprise, that he no longer cared much what the fort thought of him. He had spent his whole life being the careful, overlooked man in the corner of every room, the one whose name commanders forgot and whose company no woman sought twice. And now there was a fierce, magnificent warrior in his cellar who had given up her captaincy, her clan, her whole hard-built life, simply because she had decided, against every instinct her people had raised her with, that he was worth the keeping. He told her as much, one night sitting close beside her on the cellar floor with a single candle burning low between them. "I used to think no one would ever choose me over something easier," he said. "You could have handed me to Dragok that first night and lost nothing. You could have left me on the trail during our flight and ridden faster alone. You keep choosing the harder road, Ghorza, and I don't understand why it's me you keep choosing it for." She was quiet a moment, turning his hand over in both of hers, tracing the calluses left by years of gripping a surveyor's chain and quill instead of a sword. "You do not raise your voice when you are frightened," she said finally. "You do not strike out at what you do not understand. You gave a wounded boy your water before you knew whether he would live to thank you for it. I have ridden with warriors twice your size who could not manage half that kindness on their best day, Jeremiah Prescott. I did not choose you because it was easy. I chose you because you are, in every way that matters, the finest man I have ever known, human or orc, and I am done pretending otherwise for the comfort of people too small-hearted to see it." He kissed her then, slow and full of everything he did not have words for, and when they finally drew apart she pulled him down onto the folded blankets that had become, in these weeks, something like a shared bed in all but name, and the candle burned down to nothing while the fort slept unaware above them. And for a few stolen hours the war beyond the walls, the bounty, the blood justice, all of it fell away, and there was only the two of them, warm and certain and entirely each other's. In the only private world either of them had ever truly had, the peace did not last. 3 days later at dawn, a rider came pounding through the gate with word that Dragok's warband, now numbering near 60 riders, had been sighted a half-day's ride north, moving fast toward the fort, and that they were not alone. A second column, this one flying the Border Commission's colors under a hard-faced magistrate named Corvin Ash, had also been sighted approaching from the south, drawn by the bounty notice and determined to see it collected, one way or another, before Dragok's clan Justice could claim the prize first. Fort Kestrel, in other words, was about to become the meeting point of two hunts converging on the same woman, and Jeremiah Prescott understood, with a cold and total clarity, that there would be no more hiding, no more cellar, no more quiet stolen nights. Whatever was going to happen between Ghorza Ironblood and the two forces now closing on her, it was going to happen in the open, before the whole valley's watching eyes, and it was going to happen soon. Vane called a council in the fort's ruined hall that same morning himself, Jeremiah, and, at Jeremiah's insistence, Ghorza herself, brought up from the cellar for the first time in weeks and standing tall and unbowed in the gray daylight, her wrists no longer bound, her raider leathers still fitted close and proud despite the weeks of confinement. "Magistrate Ash will not be talked out of the bounty," Vane said, pacing before the cracked hearth. "It's commission law, and he's the sort who enjoys enforcing it to the letter. Dragok won't be talked out of his justice either. That leaves us defending this fort against both, or handing her over to one of them to spare ourselves the other." "You will not hand her over," Jeremiah said, before Vane had even finished speaking, and there was no question in his voice, only fact. "I didn't say I would," Vane said, with something almost like weariness. "I've watched you stand between that woman and a blade twice now, Prescott, and I've come to a grudging respect for it, whatever the fool settlers in the market row say about the pair of you. But I command soldiers, not miracles." 60 raiders and a magistrate's escort both bearing down on walls that haven't been properly repaired in 2 years is more than grudging respect is going to solve. Then we don't fight both, Ghorza said, and every eye in the hall turned to her. Draguk does not truly want a war with the human garrison. He wants me, and he wants the honor of dragging me back to the Blooding Stones himself. If I offer him a challenge instead, single combat, clan custom, the old right of trial by blade that no war captain can refuse without shaming himself before his own riders, he will take it. He cannot afford not to, not with 60 of his own warriors watching. And if you lose, Jeremiah's voice cracked on the word. I will not lose, she said, and there was no arrogance in it, only the flat certainty of a woman who had spent 15 summers as one of her clan's finest raid captains. But if by some fortune I do, then Draguk takes his justice and rides away, and the magistrate finds nothing left worth his bounty, and this fort is spared a war it cannot win. Either way, Fort Kestrel stands. I won't let you gamble your life on either way, Jeremiah said. It is not your gamble to allow or forbid, Mapmaker. Her voice softened just slightly as she turned to him. It is mine. Let me protect what is mine to protect, as you have protected me every day since that first night at the wagon wheel. He wanted badly to argue further, to find some other way that did not involve watching the woman he loved walk out to face a warband alone. But he saw in her eyes that this was a fight she needed to have on her own terms. And he understood, with a painful, hard-won clarity, that loving her meant trusting her strength as much as offering his own. Draguk's warband arrived at midday, 60 riders drawing up in a long dark line beyond the fort's broken walls, and Magistrate Ash's column arrived not an hour behind them, 20 mounted men in the commission's gray and gold, forcing an uneasy standoff between 3 parties who each had reason to distrust the other 2. It was Ghorza who walked out first, alone, unarmed but for the long knife at her thigh, to stand in the open ground between the fort gate and Draguk's line, and call his name across the distance in a voice that carried to every listening ear on both sides. Draguk, I claim the old right, trial by blade, clan against clan breaker, before your riders and before these humans who have no stake in the outcome. Refuse it, and every rider behind you will know your justice was never worth more than your fear of a fair fight. Draguk rode forward alone, his single long tusk catching the midday light, and for a moment Jeremiah, watching from the gate with his heart in his throat, thought he would simply order his riders to overwhelm her regardless of any old right or custom. But the murmur that ran through the Scarntooth line at Ghorza's challenge was unmistakable, and Draguk, whatever else he was, understood the cost of refusing a fair fight before 60 witnesses who would carry the tale back to every fire in the clan's territory. I accept, he said, and swung down from his horse, axe already in hand. What followed was fast and brutal, and to Jeremiah's raw nerves, endless Ghorza and Draguk circling in the open ground, blade and axe meeting in showers of sparks, both of them bleeding within the first exchange, neither giving an inch. Jeremiah could not have said, watching it, how long it truly lasted. It felt like moments and like hours both. His whole body wound tight with a fear he had never known before, not even tied to the wagon wheel that first terrible night. And then, in a single motion almost too fast to follow, Ghorza swept low under Draguk's axe swing, drove her shoulder into his chest to send him staggering, and had her knife at his throat before he had fully regained his footing, her breath ragged, blood running from a shallow cut along her forearm, but her grip absolutely steady. Yield, she said, or die knowing the last thing you saw was a clanbreaker's mercy. Draguk yielded. It cost him everything he had. Jeremiah could see it in the way his jaw clenched, but he lowered his axe and spoke the words of surrender before his own riders, and by the old right that Ghorza had invoked, that was the end of it. His warband turned and rode north within the hour, carrying word of the clanbreaker's victory back to fires that would, perhaps, begin to remember her differently than they had these past weeks. It should have ended there. It very nearly did not, because Magistrate Ash, watching the whole duel from horseback with cold, calculating eyes, chose that exact moment to make his own move, and it was here that the second, far more dangerous half of the converging hunt revealed itself. "A fine display," Ash called out, walking his horse forward as Draguk's riders withdrew, "but it changes nothing regarding the Commission's bounty. Ghorza Ironblood, formerly of the Scarntooth clan, you are named in a standing order for the deaths of 11 settlers and 2 garrison soldiers in raids across this valley over the past 3 summers. The Commission does not recognize clan trials as satisfying human law." He gestured, and a dozen of his mounted men fanned out around the exhausted, wounded Ghorza before she had even fully caught her breath from the duel. "Bind her. We ride for the border court by nightfall." No. Jeremiah was moving before he had consciously decided to, pushing past Vane's startled soldiers at the gate, out into the open ground, putting himself once again between Ghorza and men with weapons drawn. "She's under my protection and the fort's. She just fought and bled to spare this valley, a war neither side could survive." "Your protection means nothing before Commission law, Master Prescott," Ash said, not unkindly, but with the flat certainty of a man who had never once doubted his own authority. "Stand aside, or be charged alongside her as an accomplice to raid and murder." He did not stand aside. Ash's men, tired of argument, moved to seize them both, and it was in the chaos of that moment, soldiers shouting, horses shying, Ghorza too wounded and spent from the duel to fight off a dozen fresh men, that the true, thumbnail-worthy horror of the day arrived. Ash, furious at the delay and determined to make an immediate example that would satisfy the bounty's letter without the expense of a border court's slower justice, ordered a length of rope thrown over the broken gate's crossbeam, and declared that, clan breaker or not, a raider with settler blood on her hands would hang here and now, before the fort's own gathered, watching settlers, as proof the Commission's law meant more than an orc customs mercy. They dragged her, exhausted and bleeding, toward the beam while Jeremiah fought against the arms holding him back, screaming her name, and the noose went around her neck, and Ash's man beside the rope's end raised his hand to signal the pull that would end her life in front of the entire fort. "Stop!" Jeremiah's voice tore out of him with a force he had never known he possessed, and in the same breath, he wrenched free of the soldiers holding him desperation, lending him a strength his ordinary frame had never needed before, and threw himself bodily beneath the beam, one hand seizing the taut rope above Ghorza's head, the other slashing upward with the small hunting knife he had carried uselessly at his belt through every quiet week of this whole ordeal. The blade caught the rope a hand's span above her throat, and he sawed at it with a strength born entirely of terror, even as a soldier's fist caught him across the jaw, and the world briefly went white and ringing. The rope parted. Ghorza dropped, gasping, the noose still loose around her neck but the strangling weight of it gone, and Jeremiah, bleeding from a split lip, threw himself over her before another hand could reach for the rope's cut end, shielding her with his own body against the gathered soldiers, shouting up at Magistrate Ash with a raw, ragged fury that silenced the whole courtyard. "You'll have to cut through me first. I don't care what Commission law says. I care that she bled today to save every single person in this fort, and I'm not going to stand here and watch her hanged for it while I still draw breath. If that makes me a criminal in your eyes, Magistrate, then charge me, but you will not touch her again while I'm standing." It was Vane, of all people, who broke the terrible silence that followed. He stepped forward, sword drawn but pointed at the ground, and placed himself, deliberately, at Jeremiah's shoulder rather than against him. "He's right, Ash," Vane said. "I watched that duel same as you did. I watched Draguk's whole warband ride off peaceful because of what she did today. This fort owes her a debt, and I'll not stand by and see it repaid with a rope." He raised his voice to the watching settlers crowded along the walls. "Any man here who lost kin to a Scarntooth raid 3 summers back, ask yourselves plainly, Was it this woman's blade that did it, or Dragux, or some rider long since dead in some other skirmish? I've commanded this valley 2 years, and I'll tell you plain, I've never once heard her name among the raids that hurt this fort. She spent every week since she came here bleeding for people who spat at her mapmaker for the crime of loving her. I say that's earned her more than a rope." There was a long, terrible pause, the whole courtyard holding its breath, and then Hetty Marsh, the same widow who had spat at Jeremiah's feet weeks before, stepped forward from the crowd, her face pale but resolute. "My husband died at Dragux's hand, not hers," she said, quiet but carrying. "I know his mark. I saw it on the raider that killed him, and it wasn't hers. I'll not see an innocent woman hanged to satisfy paperwork, magistrate, whatever else she is." Ash looked from Vane to the crowd to Jeremiah, still shielding Ghorza's shaking body with his own, and something in the tide of the moment, some calculation of his own authority against the plain, unified refusal gathering in front of him, made him lower his hand at last. "The border court will hear a full accounting," he said stiffly, "with witnesses, and Captain Vane's testimony entered plain. But I'll not hang a woman on disputed evidence before a crowd ready to riot over it. Cut the rope from her neck fully, Master Prescott, and get her to whatever healer this fort keeps. We'll settle this properly, or not at all." It was not the end of every danger. The border court's hearing still loomed, weeks away, uncertain in its outcome. But it was, in that moment, everything. Jeremiah cut the last of the noose free with shaking hands, and Ghorza, still gasping, still bleeding from Dragux's duel, reached up and gripped his wrist with a strength that told him, more clearly than any words could have, exactly how close they had both come to losing everything in the space of a single terrible morning. The border court hearing, when it finally came 6 weeks later, was almost anticlimactic after the horror of the gate. Vane's testimony, backed by Hetty Marsh's and a half-dozen other settlers who had come slowly, to see Ghorza less as a raider and more as the fiercely loyal woman who had bled in the courtyard to spare their homes, carried more weight than Magistrate Ash's bounty notice. And the border judge, an unhurried old man named Fenimore who seemed more interested in his supper than in old feuds, dismissed the charges for want of evidence and struck the bounty from the commission's rolls entirely, on the condition that Ghorza Ironblood register as a resident of Fort Kestrel under Crown protection, answerable to Captain Vane's authority, same as any settler. Jeremiah wept when the judgment was read aloud, which embarrassed him terribly until he saw that Ghorza's eyes, too, were bright with something she would not quite name as tears, and that she gripped his hand hard enough to bruise as the words fell. They rebuilt a life together in the months that followed, in the shadow of Fort Kestrel's slowly mending walls, and the shape of that life surprised them both with its quiet steadiness after everything that had come before it. Jeremiah kept his post with the Border Commission, his maps now marked with careful new notations of orc trails and water sources that Ghorza herself provided, knowledge no human surveyor before him had ever had access to, and his reputation among the commission grew rather than shrank, whatever Vane's early warnings had suggested. Ghorza, no longer bound by clan law or bounty, took up work training the fort's soldiers in the harder lessons of border survival, and more than one settler who had once spat at Jeremiah's feet came, grudgingly and then wholeheartedly, to owe their life to a skill she had taught them. She moved out of the cellar within the week of the judgment, into the small stone cottage Jeremiah had begun rebuilding at the fort's northern wall, and there, on a clear autumn evening some months after that terrible morning at the gate, she took a length of braided leather cord from her own belt, not rope, never rope again between them. She had told him once, only ever cord freely given, and tied it around his wrist with her own hands, slow and deliberate, while she spoke words in her clan's old tongue that she then, haltingly, translated for him. "It means chosen and choosing still," she said. "It is what a scarn-toothed woman ties to the wrist of the man she claims as her own, before her whole clan, when she means the claiming to last beyond a single season." She looked up at him, firelight from the cottage hearth catching the gold in her eyes exactly as it had that very first terrible, wonderful night. "I have no clan left to stand witness, Jeremiah Prescott, but I would tie this to you regardless, if you'll have it." "I'll have it," he said, his voice thick. "And I'll have you, Ghorza Ironblood, for every season there is, however many the world decides to give us." She kissed him then, slow and certain, and later, in the small stone cottage with its single lamp burning low, and the sound of the mended fort settling quiet around them, they came together with the unhurried, deepening warmth of two people who had already weathered every hard thing the world could throw at a love no one had expected to survive. Her hands sure and reverent against him, his answering her with a devotion that had grown, through every rope and blade and rescue between them, into something neither of them would ever again have to question. A year turned, season into season, and Fort Kestrel grew steadily around them, new families arriving by wagon train to till the fields Jeremiah had surveyed, the walls fully mended under Vane's steady command, a market row that no longer went quiet when Ghorza walked through it but greeted her, more often than not, with genuine warmth from settlers who remembered exactly whose blade had spared them a war. Draguk never returned, word reaching them once, second-hand, that he had settled into a quieter captaincy under old Craghull's fading rule, the old law's harshest edges softened somewhat by the tale of a clan-breaker's honorable duel that every fire from the Scarntooth camps to the border court had by then heard told a dozen different ways. On a warm evening near the turning of that first full year, Jeremiah found Ghorza standing at the fort's northern wall, watching the sun go down gold and heavy over hills she had once raided and now, in every way that mattered, called home. He came and stood beside her, the braided cord still at his wrist, worn soft now with a year's wear, and she reached without looking and laced her rough, strong fingers through his, exactly as she had that very first storm-drenched night beneath the rock overhang when everything between them had first tipped irrevocably toward love. "Do you regret it?" he asked, not for the first time, though he already knew her answer. "Any of it? The captaincy, the clan, all you gave up that first night you cut the rope instead of tightening it?" "Not for one single moment, mapmaker," Ghorza Ironblood said, turning to press her forehead to his exactly as she had done then, her voice low and certain and entirely, unshakably his. "I have spent my whole life feared and commanded and obeyed. I did not know, until a frightened, kind man gave his water to a wounded boy and his water flask to me without knowing what I was, what it felt like to be chosen simply for who I am, and to choose someone back the very same way. I would loosen every knot I ever tied, 1,000 times over for this." He kissed her there at the wall, with the whole fort settling into evening around them and the hills gone gold and quiet in the last of the light, and understood, with a certainty as deep and steady as the stone beneath their feet, that he had found, in the most unlikely and terrifying of beginnings, exactly the home and the love that a lifetime of being overlooked had never once let him believe he deserved, and that Ghorza Ironblood, fierce and magnificent and entirely his, had no intention, now or ever, of letting either of them go.